Before we start, I need a favor. Let me know in the comments what's been done right or wrong. This also helps me create better content for you all, and check out our Creepy Tales playlist. The videos with the most views, likes, and comments will form the channel. And now we begin. Chapter 1. The Scenic Detour. The Morrison family approaches the ranger station at Pine Ridge National Forest, their hiking gear packed and ready for what should be a simple day trip to Eagle Point Overlook. When they ask Ranger Carl Barnes for directions, he smiles warmly and pulls out what appears to be an official trail map, pointing to a route marked in red ink. This is a much better way to get there, Barnes tells them as Mr. Morrison studies the map, and Mrs. Morrison asks, "Is this faster than the main trail?" Barnes nods as he responds, "Not faster, but more scenic. You'll see parts of the forest most visitors never experience." What immediately strikes Mr. Morrison as odd is that the map shows several locations that don't appear on the standard park brochure they picked up at the entrance. Crystal Falls Shortcut, Hidden Valley Loop, Whispering Ridge Trail, all marked with detailed elevation guides and distance markers, all appearing completely legitimate despite being absent from every other map of the area. These trails aren't on our GPS, their teenage daughter Kelly points out, checking her phone, and Barnes chuckles as he explains, "The Forest Service hasn't updated the digital maps yet. These are newer routes we opened last season." Mrs. Morrison nods as she says, "That makes sense," while Barnes continues, "Just follow the red markers and you can't go wrong." The Morrisons thank the helpful ranger and head toward the trailhead he indicated, which starts normally enough with standard wooden markers and well-maintained paths. But about half a mile in, Kelly notices something strange about their surroundings. "Dad," she says, pointing to their left, "wasn't that rock formation on our right when we passed it 10 minutes ago?" Mr. Morrison stops and checks his compass, frowning at the reading. "That's weird," he mutters, and Kelly asks, "What's wrong?" He responds, "According to this, we're heading northeast, but the trail marker says we're going southwest." Mrs. Morrison examines the red trail marker that Barnes had told them to follow, noting that it's pointing in a direction that seems to shift slightly when she's not looking directly at it. "Maybe the compass is broken," she suggests, but Kelly shakes her head as she replies, "My phone's GPS is showing the same reading. We're definitely going northeast." They continue following the red markers despite the compass discrepancy, but the terrain begins to feel wrong in ways that are difficult to articulate. The path slopes upward consistently, requiring steady climbing for over an hour, yet their altitude readings on both GPS devices show they're somehow getting lower with each step. "This doesn't make sense," Mr. Morrison says, stopping to catch his breath, and Mrs. Morrison agrees, "We've been climbing for 2 hours, but my fitness tracker says we're 300 feet lower than when we started." Kelly checks her own device and confirms, "Mine shows the same thing. How is that possible?" That's when they notice the trees. What had seemed like normal forest growth from a distance reveals itself to be subtly impossible when examined closely. Pine trees growing in perfect spirals, their trunks twisted in helical patterns that make the eye water to follow. Oak trees with branches that seem to weave through each other without occupying the same space, creating geometric patterns that shouldn't be structurally possible. "Dad," Kelly whispers, her voice tight with growing unease, "look at the stream." The creek that runs alongside their path appears to be flowing upward, its water moving against gravity in a steady cascade that climbs over rocks and fallen logs before disappearing into the canopy above. The sound is normal, the rushing, bubbling noise of moving water, but the visual contradicts everything they understand about how streams are supposed to work. Mrs. Morrison sits down heavily on a fallen log, staring at the impossible stream. "We need to go back," she says, and Mr. Morrison nods as he responds, "Agreed, something's very wrong here." Kelly asks, "But which way is back?" They turn to retrace their steps, but the path behind them has changed. Where they remember a straight trail with clear red markers, they now see 3 different paths branching in directions that don't match their memory of how they arrived. Each path has red markers pointing in different directions, and each appears to lead through terrain that looks completely unfamiliar. "This is impossible," Mr. Morrison says, checking his GPS again, and Kelly responds, "The device shows we haven't moved from our starting coordinates in the past 3 hours." Mrs. Morrison asks, "How can we be in the same location when we've been walking continuously?" That's when Ranger Barnes steps out from behind a tree that definitely wasn't large enough to hide a person moments before. "Having trouble with the trail?" he asks cheerfully, and Mr. Morrison turns to him with relief as he responds, "Thank God you're here. We seem to be lost." Barnes nods understandingly as he says, "The forest can be confusing for first-time visitors to this section." "First-time visitors?" Mrs. Morrison questions, and Barnes clarifies, "To the Hidden Valley area. You're in a special part of the forest now." Kelly asks, "Special how?" Barnes explains, "Different rules apply here. Physics works a bit differently when you're between dimensions." The Morrison family stares at him in confusion, and Mr. Morrison asks, "Between dimensions? What does that mean?" Barnes pulls out his own map, but this one shows their current location as a blank white space with no trail markers or geographical features. "You're in a pocket reality," he explains casually, and Mrs. Morrison stammers, "A what?" Barnes continues, "A space that exists adjacent to normal reality. Same forest, different rules." Kelly looks around at the spiral trees and upward flowing stream with new understanding. "You brought us here on purpose," she realizes, and Barnes nods approvingly as he responds, "Very perceptive, yes. I guided you into one of my special places." "Your special places?" Mr. Morrison asks, backing away from the ranger, and Barnes smiles as he explains, "I've learned to create pockets of altered reality within the forest, spaces where I can modify the laws of physics to suit my needs." Mrs. Morrison whispers, "That's impossible," and Barnes chuckles as he responds, "Impossible in normal reality, certainly, but we're not in normal reality anymore." To demonstrate his point, Barnes casually reaches up and touches the sun, which has been moving in slow circles overhead rather than following a normal arc across the sky. At his touch, the sun shifts direction, beginning to move in a figure-8 pattern that casts shadows in constantly changing directions. "I can reshape this space however I choose," Barnes explains as the Morrison family watches in terror, and Kelly asks, "Why are you doing this to us?" Barnes responds, "Because isolated families make excellent test subjects for experimenting with dimensional manipulation, and because once you're in one of my pocket realities, leaving becomes problematic." The paths behind them have disappeared entirely now, replaced by an endless forest that stretches in all directions with no variation in landscape or vegetation. The spiral trees pulse with unnatural light, the upward-flowing stream has formed impossible waterfalls that climb toward a sky filled with multiple moons, and the ground beneath their feet feels solid but appears to be transparent, revealing an infinite void below. "Welcome to my laboratory," Barnes says with satisfaction as the Morrison family realizes they're trapped in a place where escape routes don't exist because the concepts of exit and return have been edited out of local reality by a park ranger who has learned to treat dimensional space like a personal playground. Chapter 2: The Endless Loop. Experienced hikers Jack Sullivan and Maria Gonzalez arrive at Redwood Canyon expecting a straightforward 3-mile loop trail that should take them exactly 90 minutes to complete. When they ask Ranger Carl Barnes about trail conditions, he provides them with what appears to be an updated map showing a more interesting route that includes scenic overlooks and geological formations not mentioned in their guidebook. This version takes you past some incredible rock formations, Barnes tells them as Jack studies the map, and Maria asks, "How much longer is this route?" Barnes responds, "Same distance, just more interesting terrain. You'll love the variety." The map shows clear trail markers and elevation profiles that look completely professional, with detailed notations about points of interest and estimated hiking times. What seems slightly odd is that several landmarks are marked with names like Echo Stone and Mirror Ridge, that don't appear in any of their reference materials. These formations aren't in our hiking guide, Maria points out, and Barnes explains, the guide companies haven't caught up with some of our newer discoveries. These features were only properly mapped last year. Jack nods as he says, makes sense, while Barnes continues, just follow the blue blazes and you'll see everything marked on the map. Jack and Maria set out confidently on what appears to be a well-maintained trail with standard blue markers painted on trees at regular intervals. The first mile proceeds normally, with gradually ascending terrain through dense forest that matches their expectations perfectly. But as they round a bend marked on the map as First Overlook, they encounter a distinctive rock formation, a massive granite boulder balanced precariously on three smaller stones, creating a natural arch that's impossible to miss. That's really something, Jack says, taking photos of the unusual formation, and Maria checks their progress on the map as she responds, according to this, we should see 2 more formations like this before we complete the loop. They continue hiking, following the blue blazes through terrain that feels familiar but somehow repetitive. After another 30 minutes, they encounter the same granite arch formation, balanced identically on 3 smaller stones in exactly the same configuration. Didn't we already pass this? Maria asks, checking their GPS coordinates, and Jack responds, I thought so too, but the map shows similar formations at different points. Maria studies their position readings and adds, but we're definitely moving forward, we've covered another half-mile since the first sighting. They photograph the second arch and continue following the blue blazes, but something about the terrain feels increasingly wrong. Not just similar to what they've already hiked, but identical. The same fallen log blocking the path, the same pattern of moss growth on specific trees, the same small creek crossing with the same arrangement of stepping stones. Jack, Maria says, stopping beside a dead pine tree with distinctive lightning damage, I swear we passed this exact tree an hour ago. Jack checks his GPS readings and frowns. According to this, we've been hiking for 2.5 hours, he says, and Maria asks, how far have we traveled? Jack responds, the device shows exactly 0 movement from our starting coordinates. That's impossible, Maria says, but as they round the next bend, they encounter the granite arch formation for the 3rd time, or what appears to be the 3rd time, though their GPS insists they've covered over 4 miles of distance while remaining in exactly the same location. This has to be a different formation, Jack insists, but when he checks his photos, the 3 images are identical down to the smallest details. The same shadows, the same lichen patterns, the same small shrub growing beside the left support stone. Maria sits down on a trailside rock, studying their map and GPS readings with growing confusion. We've been following a straight trail with clear markers for 3 hours, she says, and Jack nods as he responds, but somehow we keep encountering the same landmarks. Maria continues, and our position readings haven't changed despite continuous movement. That's when they notice the blue blazes themselves are behaving strangely. The painted markers that should indicate trail direction appear to be pointing in different directions each time they look, as if the arrows are rotating slowly when not directly observed. The trail markers are moving, Jack says slowly, and Maria looks up from her map to confirm, I saw that too. They're definitely changing direction. They decide to experiment by marking their own trail with small cairns, stacking distinctive rock piles at regular intervals to track their actual progress. But when they return to check their first marker after 30 minutes of hiking, they find it in a completely different location relative to the granite arch, even though both landmarks should maintain fixed positions. The whole landscape is shifting, Maria realizes, and Jack asks, but how is that possible? Maria responds, it's like we're walking on a treadmill that's disguised as a trail, moving continuously but never actually getting anywhere. That's when Ranger Barnes steps out from behind the granite arch formation, though neither hiker saw him approach from any direction. Having navigation difficulties? He asks pleasantly, and Jack turns to him with relief as he responds, thank God you're here. We seem to be stuck in some kind of loop. Ah yes, Barnes says knowingly, you've discovered the eternal trail. One of my favorite dimensional experiments. Dimensional experiments? Maria questions, and Barnes nods as he explains, this section of forest exists in a spatially recursive loop. Every path leads back to itself, but the landscape rotates slightly with each iteration. Jack asks, what does that mean exactly? Barnes responds, it means you're trapped in a space where forward progress is an illusion. You can walk forever without ever reaching a destination. To demonstrate his point, Barnes gestures toward the trail ahead, and suddenly the path visible in front of them extends infinitely into the distance, showing hundreds of identical granite arch formations stretching toward the horizon in perfect repetition. I've folded this section of space back on itself, Barnes explains casually, and Maria stammers, folded space? That's science fiction. Barnes chuckles as he responds, science fiction from your perspective, perhaps? But I've learned to manipulate spatial dimensions as easily as rearranging furniture. Jack pulls out his emergency whistle to signal for help, but when he blows it, the sound echoes infinitely through the recursive landscape, bouncing between identical terrain features in an endless loop that grows louder rather than fading. Sound behaves differently here too, Barnes notes with satisfaction, and Maria asks, why are you doing this to us? Barnes responds, because experienced hikers make excellent test subjects. You notice spatial anomalies more quickly than casual walkers, which helps me refine my techniques. The blue blazes on surrounding trees begin pulsing in unison, creating a hypnotic pattern that seems to stretch and compress the landscape around them. The granite arch multiplies into dozens of identical formations, each casting shadows that point in impossible directions under a sun that appears to be positioned at multiple points in the sky simultaneously. The beauty of recursive space, Barnes explains as Jack and Maria watch their familiar hiking trail transform into an infinite maze of repetition, is that escape requires understanding dimensional geometry that human minds aren't equipped to process. You could walk for years and never find an exit that doesn't lead back to your starting point. The trail map in Maria's hands begins rewriting itself, showing their location as an endless spiral with no beginning or end, while their GPS devices display coordinates that change constantly but always return to zero. Around them, the forest extends infinitely in all directions, filled with identical landmarks and recursive terrain features that mock the very concept of progress or destination. Welcome to my study in spatial psychology, Barnes says with pride as Jack and Maria realize they're trapped in a dimension where the journey has become more important than any possible destination, because in a recursive reality, every destination is simultaneously the starting point and the place they can never leave. Chapter 3: The Upside-Down Valley. Scout Troop 847 approaches Ranger Carl Barnes with excitement about their planned overnight camping trip, and when Scoutmaster Peterson asks about interesting destinations for merit badge activities, Barnes produces a specialized map showing what he calls Adventure Valley. This is perfect for orienteering and geology badges, Barnes tells the group as Peterson studies the detailed topographical markings, and Scout Leader Williams asks, "How difficult is the terrain?" Barnes responds, "Challenging but manageable for experienced scouts. You'll see geological formations unlike anything in standard textbooks." The map shows Adventure Valley as a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by steep ridges, with detailed annotations about unique rock formations, underground caves, and observation points that would be ideal for their planned earth science activities. What seems unusual is that the valley doesn't appear on any of their standard topographical maps or GPS databases. "This area isn't in our reference materials," Peterson points out, and Barnes explains, "It's a recently discovered formation. Geological surveys are still cataloging the unique features." Williams nods as he says, "That would explain the detailed annotations on your map," while Barnes continues, "Just follow the yellow blazes down the ridge trail and you'll find the valley entrance clearly marked." The 12 scouts set out enthusiastically, following yellow trail markers down what appears to be a standard ridge descent through dense forest. The first mile proceeds normally, with gradually declining elevation that matches their expectations for reaching a valley floor. But as they crest what should be the final ridge before Adventure Valley, Scout Marcus Chern stops and points ahead with confusion. "Scoutmaster," he says, staring at the landscape below, "that doesn't look like any valley I've ever seen." Instead of a bowl-shaped depression, they're looking down at a landscape where trees grow downward from what appears to be solid sky, their roots anchored in blue atmosphere while their crowns point toward the earth below. Waterfalls cascade upward from rocky outcroppings, flowing into clouds that drift beneath their feet rather than overhead. "This has to be an optical illusion," Peterson says, but Scout Sarah Kim responds, "I'm looking at it through binoculars. Those trees are definitely growing in reverse." Scout Danny Rodriguez adds, "And the water is definitely flowing upward. I can see fish swimming against gravity in those streams." Scoutmaster Peterson checks his compass and altimeter readings, both of which provide normal measurements that contradict what they're observing. "According to our instruments, we're looking down into a standard valley at normal elevation," he says, and Williams asks, "Then why does everything appear upside down?" "Maybe it's a geological anomaly," suggests Scout Lisa Park, but Marcus shakes his head as he responds, "Geological anomalies don't reverse gravity. This looks like the entire valley exists in some kind of altered physics zone." That's when they notice the yellow blazes leading down into Adventure Valley are painted on surfaces that shouldn't be able to support paint, the undersides of overhanging rocks, the interior walls of tree hollows, even on patches of empty air that appear solid when viewed from certain angles. "Those trail markers are floating," Sarah observes, and Danny confirms, "some of them are definitely not attached to any physical surface." Peterson asks, "How is that possible?" Lisa responds, "Maybe the whole valley operates under different physical laws." Despite their confusion, the scouts follow the yellow blazes down into Adventure Valley, expecting to encounter normal terrain once they reach the valley floor. Instead, they discover that "down" is a relative concept that changes based on their position and perspective. What appears to be a steep descent becomes a gentle horizontal walk, while paths that look level require them to climb vertically up cliff faces that feel like flat ground beneath their feet. "I'm walking on a wall," Marcus announces, looking back at his fellow scouts who appear to be standing sideways on what he perceives as a vertical rock face, and Sarah responds, "From my perspective, you're the one standing sideways." Danny adds, "We're all walking on different planes, but somehow we're staying together." The physical sensation matches normal hiking, solid ground beneath their feet, normal effort required for movement, familiar resistance from their backpacks. But their visual perspective shows them climbing up cliff faces, walking across vertical tree trunks, and stepping on surfaces that appear to be empty air. "This is like being inside a three-dimensional puzzle," Lisa observes, and Peterson nods as he says, "A puzzle where the pieces don't follow normal geometric rules." Williams checks his GPS coordinates and reports, "According to our devices, we're all standing in the same location despite being spread across what appears to be 100 yards of varied terrain." That's when Ranger Barnes appears, stepping out of what looks like solid rock, but behaves like an open doorway. "How are you enjoying Adventure Valley?" he asks cheerfully, and Peterson turns to him with relief as he responds, "We're experiencing some very unusual terrain features. Is this area known for gravitational anomalies?" "Oh, there's nothing anomalous about it," Barnes explains casually, and Marcus asks, "Then how do you explain what we're seeing?" Barnes responds, "You're in a pocket dimension where gravitational orientation is subjective rather than absolute. Up and down depend on your frame of reference." To demonstrate his point, Barnes steps onto what appears to be empty air and begins walking upward at a 90-degree angle, his boots making contact with invisible surfaces while the scouts watch in amazement. "I've learned to create spaces where normal physics become suggestions rather than laws," Barnes continues, now standing on what the scouts perceive as a vertical cliff face, and William stammers, "That's impossible." Barnes chuckles as he responds, "Impossible in normal reality, certainly, but Adventure Valley operates under my personal interpretation of how space should behave." Scout Marcus attempts to follow Barnes's path, but finds himself walking on the underside of what appears to be an overhanging ledge, his hair hanging downward toward the sky while his feet maintain solid contact with the rock surface above. "Each of you is experiencing gravity from a different directional orientation," Barnes explains as the scouts discover they can walk on any surface that appears solid, regardless of its angle or apparent physical impossibility, and Sarah asks, "How are you controlling this?" Barnes responds, "The same way you control your hand movements, with practice, dimensional manipulation becomes as natural as any other learned skill." The yellow blazes begin moving around them, repositioning themselves on different surfaces to create new path options that lead in directions the scouts' minds struggle to process. Trees that were growing downward rotate to grow sideways, then upward, then in spiral patterns that hurt to follow visually. "The beautiful thing about subjective gravity," Barnes explains as he casually rotates the entire valley 90 degrees, causing half the scouts to find themselves standing on what had been vertical surfaces moments before, "is that it makes escape impossible. You can't find an exit when every direction is simultaneously up, down, left, right, forward, and backward." Waterfalls begin flowing in multiple directions simultaneously, creating impossible geometric patterns in the air, while fish swim through clouds and birds nest in underground caves that appear overhead. The scouts' compasses spin wildly as magnetic north becomes a relative concept that changes based on their gravitational orientation. "Welcome to my laboratory for studying human adaptation to altered physics," Barnes says with satisfaction as the 12 scouts realize they're trapped in a dimension where the fundamental rules of reality bend to the will of a park ranger who treats three-dimensional space like a personal art project, rotating and reshaping their prison with casual expertise, while they struggle to understand which way leads to safety in a world where all directions exist simultaneously. Chapter 4: The Fold in Space. It began 20 years ago when Park Ranger Carl Barnes discovered a cave that existed in 7 different locations simultaneously, accessible from multiple points throughout the forest yet containing the same interior space regardless of which entrance he used. Inside this impossible cavern, Barnes found an artifact that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about the nature of reality. The Void Compass, a crystalline device that appeared to exist in multiple dimensions at once, its surface constantly shifting between transparent and opaque while displaying mathematical symbols that describe geometric relationships beyond three-dimensional space. The compass wasn't simply an object. It was a tool for manipulating the fundamental structure of space itself, allowing its user to fold reality like origami paper, creating pocket dimensions and dimensional shortcuts that existed independently of normal physics. When Barnes first touched the artifact, his consciousness expanded to perceive space as a malleable medium rather than a fixed framework, showing him how to create custom realities where he could rewrite the basic rules of existence. Lost Ranger, the compass had whispered to him in harmonics that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his spatial awareness. "You have found the tool that shapes worlds, the instrument that bends space to will rather than accepting the limitations of linear dimension." 20 years later, Carl Barnes stands in that same multi-dimensional cave as his latest experiments in spatial manipulation near completion. The Scout Troop's confusion in Adventure Valley has provided valuable data about human adaptation to altered gravitational fields, while the Morrison family's terror in his spiral forest demonstrated how effectively pocket dimensions can disorient and trap ordinary visitors. Faithful architect of impossible spaces, the Void Compass speaks to him through crystalline resonance that makes the cave walls shimmer with mathematical equations. 20 years of dedicated experimentation, 20 years of crafting dimensional puzzles, 20 years of expanding our influence through custom realities. Barnes kneels before the compass as he has every few months since discovering it, reporting his activities to the alien intelligence that inhabits the device and grants him power over spatial dimensions. The cave around him has evolved dramatically over 2 decades, expanded and modified through dimensional folding until it serves as a control center for his network of pocket realities. The modern world presents new challenges for dimensional manipulation, Barnes reports to the glowing compass, and the artifact responds. Elaborate on these challenges, architect. Barnes continues, park visitors carry GPS devices and emergency beacons that attempt to maintain connection with normal spacetime, but their technology becomes useless once I fold them into pocket dimensions. The crystalline surface pulses with satisfaction as the compass processes this information. Technology fear is manageable, the alien intelligence agrees, and Barnes nods as he says, humans still trust official authority more than their instruments. The compass adds, your ranger uniform provides excellent camouflage for dimensional manipulation. Through his supernatural bond with the compass, Barnes can perceive the network of pocket dimensions he's created throughout the forest over 20 years of experimentation. Spiral forests where physics bend in impossible curves, recursive loops that trap hikers in eternal repetition, gravitational puzzles that challenge human understanding of up and down. Each custom reality serves as both a trap for visitors and a laboratory for testing the limits of spatial manipulation. The scout troop provided excellent data about group dynamics in altered gravity fields. Barnes continues his report, and the compass brightens as it responds. Group experiments yield superior results to individual testing. Barnes explains, when multiple subjects experience dimensional anomalies simultaneously, their attempts to rationalize the impossible generate fascinating psychological responses. Family-based experiments are the compass's preferred methodology, the reason it encourages Barnes to target groups with strong emotional bonds. The terror and confusion generated when families are trapped together in impossible spaces provides the richest data about human adaptation to dimensional manipulation, while their love for each other prevents them from abandoning trapped members. And what of expansion protocols? The compass inquires, its consciousness probing Barnes's memories for strategic planning, and Barnes responds, I've identified several opportunities for larger-scale dimensional experimentation. He continues, there's a summer music festival that brings thousands of visitors into the forest, a hunting convention that hosts families for week-long expeditions, multiple recreational events that could serve as testing grounds for mass dimensional displacement. The compass's crystalline structure shifts through impossible geometric configurations as it processes these possibilities. Mass folding events, it muses with anticipation, and Barnes confirms, exactly, instead of creating individual pocket dimensions, I could fold entire sections of the forest into custom realities simultaneously. The alien intelligence radiates approval through their connection like cold starlight. 20 years of faithful service have transformed Barnes into something beyond human comprehension, a being that exists primarily to experiment with dimensional manipulation while retaining just enough of his original personality to understand the scope of his transformation. There is a concerning development, the compass announces, and Barnes feels the alien intelligence focusing on him with unusual intensity as it continues. Other dimensional architects across the network have reported increased resistance from human authorities. The compass explains, government agencies that employ spatial anomaly specialists, military units trained to recognize dimensional manipulation, scientific organizations that study impossible geometries. This information alarms Barnes significantly. For 2 decades, his dimensional experiments have operated beneath human awareness, dismissed as unexplained disappearances by authorities who lack the conceptual framework to recognize spatial manipulation. If that protective ignorance is eroding, it could threaten his entire network of pocket realities. What are your instructions? Barnes asks, though he suspects he already knows the answer, and the compass responds immediately, acceleration combined with revelation. The age of subtle dimensional experimentation approaches its end, the alien intelligence explains, and Barnes nods as he says, if humanity develops the ability to detect and counter our spatial manipulation. The compass continues, we must complete our data collection before that capability fully manifests, while simultaneously demonstrating the futility of resistance. Barnes understands the implications perfectly. Instead of creating isolated pocket dimensions for small groups, he'll need to orchestrate mass folding events that demonstrate his mastery over space itself. Instead of hiding behind the facade of helpful park ranger, he'll need to reveal his true nature as architect of impossible realities. The forest can support continental-scale dimensional folding, he confirms to the glowing compass, and the artifact pulses with agreement as he continues, I can create pocket realities large enough to contain entire cities. Custom dimensions where thousands of people exist under altered physics. Ancient power flows into him through their connection, abilities far beyond anything the compass has granted him in 20 years of service. The capacity to fold space on massive scales, to create dimensional labyrinths that span multiple states, to project his reality-shaping influence across continental distances without requiring physical proximity to manipulation site. And if human authorities attempt direct intervention? Barnes asks, and the compass's response carries mathematical certainty, as it says, then they will discover that their three-dimensional thinking is inadequate for combating four-dimensional warfare. The artifact continues, we can fold their forces into pocket realities where their weapons and tactics become meaningless abstractions. Barnes rises from his kneeling position as the compass's enhanced power settles into his transformed physiology. 20 years of faithful service have prepared him for this moment, when isolated dimensional experiments give way to spatial warfare, when the alien intelligence behind his abilities finally reveals itself to a world unprepared for the truth about malleable reality. The age of linear space ends now, the compass declares as dimensional equations begin manifesting visibly in the air around them, and Barnes responds, let humanity discover that their universe is far more flexible than they ever imagined. The artifact's crystalline surface blazes with impossible light as it adds, let them understand that some architects reshape reality according to geometries their minds cannot process. Barnes walks back toward the surface world with abilities that will transform him from isolated spatial manipulator into a force of dimensional conquest, ready to begin folding reality on a scale that will demonstrate to humanity that their assumptions about the nature of space have always been tragically limited.